Hello and welcome back. So today is Thursday, and that means we're going to be looking at Git. So I wanted to talk today about a pretty useful feature called Git Stash. So oftentimes when we've been talking about Git, we've been talking about committing things or adding them. But what happens if you're in the middle of working and you want to move on to something else, or you have to move on to something else more likely, but you're not ready to commit what you're working on yet. So it's not done. You don't want to pollute the commit history with it. Well, that's where Git Stash comes in. Essentially, Git Stash is a way to tuck away what you're working on into a stash, and you can bring it back later. So we're just going to jump right into it and get into our terminal and see what we can do with Git Stash. So as always, we'll begin by cloning this repository. Okay, so now that we're in our repository, let's check and see what we have. All right, so we have our README, and we have this important feature. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just begin working. We're going to go ahead and switch to a new branch. That branch is going to be called Adding Cool Stuff. So say we're swapped to our new branch, and what we want to do is work on our cool stuff. So we're going to go ahead and open Nano, and we're going to, just add some new things. We'll add some new print statements here, and that's what we're up to. We're just doing our work. And then suddenly, our boss comes along, says, hey, the main branch has an issue. You have to get in there and fix it right away. Well, we first have to exit Nano with Control-O, Enter, Control-X. Then, instead of committing these changes right now, because we're not really done, right? We are still working. This commit is not yet complete. So what we could do instead is add it in this incomplete state with Git Stash. Now, it's always good etiquette, just like with our commits, to leave a message here. This is so that we can be sure we know what was going on when we stashed it. So I'm going to leave a message to myself saying that I was working on new print statement. Once we've done this, we can go ahead and press enter. Now, you can see that we saved the working directory and index state on adding cool stuff was working on new print statement. So now that we've stashed something, how can we look at it in our stash? Well, luckily for us, the command's very straightforward with git stash list. You'll notice that the stash is in this format here. It's got stash at, and then the element, and then it has the information about which branch we were on, as well as our message. If we didn't include a message, it would automatically include the commit hash. But since we included a message, it doesn't need to do that. Okay, so first things first, we're going to go ahead and switch to main. We're going to do that using the command git switch main. Now that we're on our main, we can go ahead and nano into our important feature. We're going to change the broken variable to false. Then we'll go ahead and Control-O, Enter, Control-X. Now that we've done that, we can git add dot or important feature. Then we can git commit -m fixed broken feature. Now we can go ahead and push those changes. Awesome. We check our Git status. We see we're up to date. Everything's happy. Now, we weren't done working, so we're going to go ahead and go back to our stashed changes. We can use the command git stash list, and we remember that we were working on the adding cool stuff branch on that new print statement. So we'll need to get back to that branch using git switch adding cool stuff. Now that we're here, we can use the git stash apply command. Now that's going to apply the most recent stashed changes. So if we look at our list, we only have one, but notice that it's the 0th element. Whenever we use git stash apply with no reference, it is going to apply the most recent or the 0th stash. So let's just look at an example of what it might look like if we had multiple things in our stash. So now that we have the second stash saved, let's check out our stash list. So as you can see, Even though we made this stash second, it is the first stash in our list. And that's because the stash works like a stack. So that means that the last thing that we put in our stash is the first thing that will come out if we're just using the commands without indexing a specific stash reference. So let's go ahead and use that so we can see what it looks like. It's very straightforward. So we can use get stash apply to apply things from our stash back onto our working branch. Now, if I want to apply the second thing, or the element number 1, since it's 0 indexed, I can just use get stash apply 1. Now, if I look at that file of cool stuff, you'll see that we still have the changes that I made when I stashed it. So even though I didn't commit anything, I didn't add anything, those changes are still there, and that's fantastic. So let's see what happens now when we look at our get stash list. Hang on a second. Didn't we just apply this first element? Well, we absolutely did. So one of the important things to note about stash apply is that it doesn't remove the stash from the stash list. In order to do that, we have to manually drop it with get stash drop, and we can index 1 since that's the one we want to drop. Now when we check our get stash list, you'll see that 1 is gone. So surely there's got to be an easier way to handle this, right? Well, luckily for us, GitHub has everything thought of, and so we can just use get stash pop. Now, because we're using this with no reference, it's just going to pop the most recent stash. Because our stash is only one element right now, it doesn't really matter, but it is important to keep in mind that you can and should specify what you want to pop and apply. So we use get stash pop, and when we look at our get stash list, you'll see now that there is no stash list. And that's exactly what we want to see. So that did both get stash apply and get stash drop all in one. Very nice for us. So we can go ahead and look at our get status and see that we've applied both of these changes that we had in our stash to the same branch. Get stash is a very flexible and powerful tool, but it does take some time to get used to. I would suggest incorporating it into your workflow as soon as possible so you start getting used to it. Okay, and that's been a simple introduction to Get Stash. So I hope that you enjoyed that, and we will see you in the next one.